Hi, today's lesson is about story structure, and primarily we're going to focus on the plot of the story or the elements of the plot. We will, though, introduce setting and characters as well. So we're going to use a very familiar story to many people, and that's the story of Cinderella. A lot of the time, if you use something that's already familiar in order to learn something new, it's a very effective way of learning. Targets for today, you should be able to define and give examples of the setting, characters, plot, and conflict in a story. And then we're going to focus in on plot, and in the parts of the plot, you should be able to identify them. You're only going to be asked on the RLA test to questions that refer to plot or refer to the conflict. They are not going to ask you what the definitions of these are. This is just background information. So you will have an understanding of these ideas that they will ask you about. First, we're going to talk about vocabulary. The setting is just the time and the place. What period of time is it in and what location? The main characters are the characters that are well described throughout the story. The conflict is the issue or the problem in the story that the main characters are involved in. And the plot is the events that surround that conflict. Most stories follow a pattern, and that pattern is, I'm using a triangle to show that, even though this isn't necessarily a good way to show it, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. So first there is the exposition, then the inciting incident is part of the rising action. Then you reach that tipping point, that climax in the story. Then you have falling action and that moment of final suspense. And then you have the resolution of the conflict. To detect the parts, you have to fit them together like you would a jigsaw puzzle. You might need to identify one part first to figure out the rest of them. So first, let's talk about the exposition. That's where they introduce the characters and the setting. I'm not sure why they use the word exposition. I normally would call it the introduction in the story. This is where you begin to get a feeling about the conflict that the characters will be facing. This is before the plot is even set in motion. This is just setting the scene. When you begin to see that conflict and understand what the conflict really is, then you know that you're beyond the exposition. Okay, so we are going to identify the characters, the setting, and the beginning of the conflict in the first part of Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a kind girl named Cinderella. All of the animals loved her, especially two mice named Gus and Jacques. They would do anything for their, oh, my Sorry. On my screen, part of it's covered up, so now it's undone. So they do anything for the girl that they called Cinderella. Cinderella lived with her stepmother and two stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella. They were mean to Cinderella, making her work all day, cleaning, sewing, and cooking. She tried her best to make them happy. Cinderella's stepmother, Lady Tremaine, was cold, cruel, and jealous of Cinderella's charm and beauty. She enjoyed giving Cinderella extra chores to do, such as bathing her cat, Lucifer. So we've been introduced to the main characters, the two stepsisters, Cinderella, and the stepmother. We also know what kind of characters they are. Some of their character traits are described here. In this one, it shows that the Lady Tremaine is a cold, cruel, and jealous kind of person. Cinderella is charming and beautiful. So what's the setting? In this case, the setting is fairy tale land. We don't know really what time period. It would be maybe in medieval times when they lived in castles and went to a ball at the king's palace. The main characters, we've been introduced to the four people that are the main characters. And do we have a beginning understanding of the conflict? Usually, conflict can be described in one of these three ways. One person against another or against a group, person against nature, or a person with an internal struggle. So the conflict in this example was definitely the first one, Cinderella versus her stepmother and stepsisters. Next, after the exposition, is the rising action. And usually the rising action will begin with some kind of event or incident. This is where the primary conflict is introduced and it sets the plot in motion. In Cinderella, what would be the inciting incident? The day they all got invited to the royal ball at the palace. So back to our story. One day a messenger arrived with a special invitation. There was going to be a royal ball at the palace. The king wanted his son to find a bride. Every young woman in the kingdom was invited, including Cinderella. So now we get the rising action. These are all of the events leading up to the climax, the peak of the story. Usually it's the rising action is that bulk of the story that's in between the inciting incident and the climax. Here we go. Here's some of the events, the string of events that occur. Cinderella was very excited about the ball. In the attic, she found a dress that had belonged to her mother. It was a bit old-fashioned, but Cinderella could make it beautiful. Lady Tremaine didn't want Cinderella to go to the ball. She wanted the prince to meet Anastasia and Drizella. Maybe he would marry one of them. Lady Tremaine kept Cinderella busy with chores that would take her all night to finish. While Cinderella was working, the mice and the birds fixed her dress. They added ribbons and beads that the two stepsisters had thrown away. Working together, the animals turned a simple dress into a fabulous gown. Cinderella was overjoyed when she saw the dress. Now she could go to the ball. "Oh, thank you so much," Cinderella said to Gus, Jacques, and the birds. You can see that we're building up to the climax. When the stepsisters saw their old ribbons and beads on Cinderella's dress, they flew into a rage. Again, character descriptions or character traits for the stepsisters. They ripped the dress and pulled off the beads. Lady Tremaine didn't stop them. Cinderella's dream of going to the ball was through. Now we get to the climax. This is the turning point. This is where the characters confront the core of the conflict. Remember, though, this is not really the time that the conflict is resolved. This is where the main character would learn something new or some big change is taking place so that the conflict can be addressed. And back to my comment about maybe this triangle isn't such a good example, is that in many stories, the rising action is much longer than the falling action on the other side. So really, the peak of this triangle, the climax, could be way more to the right on this screen, and then the rising action would be very small, which it is in this case of Cinderella. Cinderella ran away to the garden to cry. Suddenly, her fairy godmother appeared. With a wave of her wand, she turned a pumpkin into an elegant coach. Cinderella could now go to the ball, but her dress was still ruined. Bibbidi bobbidi boo, said the fairy godmother, waving her wand again. Cinderella was now wearing a beautiful gown and sparkling glass slippers. But all of this came with a warning. When the clock struck midnight, the magic spell would wear off. At the ball, Prince Charming couldn't take his eyes off of Cinderella. The orchestra played and the prince began to dance with the wonderful girl whose name he still didn't know. For Cinderella, the night was a dream come true. Before too long, the clock began to strike midnight. Goodbye, Cinderella said, hurrying away. Come back, called the prince. I don't even know your name. As Cinderella fled, one of her glass slippers came off. So now we've got the falling action. These are the events after the climax. The climax was where that conflict was addressed. Now, falling action is usually where the characters resume some kind of normal life, even though that life could have been changed in the climax. These are the events that lead toward the end of the story called the resolution. This is where the main character is tested one more time, that moment of final suspense. Not every story has this one moment. The prince sent the Grand Duke to find the girl who fit the glass slipper. Lady Tremaine locked Cinderella in the attic, but Cinderella's mouse friends freed her. Then Lady Tremaine tripped the Grand Duke, and the glass slipper shattered. But Cinderella had the other in her pocket, and it fit. Now we have the resolution. In fairy tales, this is where they lived happily ever after. So resolution, the conflict is over. It's how the story ends. So the prince and Cinderella were married. Everybody rejoiced, and they lived happily ever after. So you might want to first look for the climax, or you might want to find the conflict in the main characters first, whichever you are most comfortable with. Another hint is to watch for the shift in mood. Things can either go from good to bad or bad to good. Not every story follows this exact pattern, but you will find, if you pay attention, that actually a lot of them do. So your turn to practice. Go to your Canvas assignment and your practice will be listed there. Thank you all for listening.